Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're just admitting everybody to the webinar and the event will get started immediately. Thank you for joining us, folks. We're just admitting everybody to the webinar and the event will get started in just a moment. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. We're thrilled to have you all join us here, both here in the Zoom webinar and, of course, live on YouTube. We have a very special event ahead of you, or ahead of all of us. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson Booksellers is located in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. Your host for this evening, Ify Chiwetelu, is situated in Takaranto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. As all of our guests stretch across this country, we're joined by Elamin Abdelmahmoud, who is coming to us live from Calgary, which is in Treaty 7 territory. We acknowledge the Treaty 7 nations, the Piikani, the Siksika, Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda, and of course the Tsuut'ina First Nations. We acknowledge the ancestral territory of the Siksikapi, apologies, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the home of the Métis Region 3 of Southern Alberta. We are here tonight to celebrate the Prairie publication of Son of Elsewhere, a memoir in pieces by, of course, Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Elamin is one of the most beloved media personalities of his generation, as per both the publicity for this book and in reality. And we're thrilled to have him here. This is a one-of-a-kind reflection on Blackness, faith, language, pop culture, and the challenges and rewards of finding your way in the world, spanning topics that cover everything from wrestling to country music to the OC. I'd like to begin by thanking McClelland Stewart, of course, for publishing this book, and to Penguin Random House Canada for helping to put on this event. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors of this event, the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, for helping to spread the word and bring all of this together. We are delighted to partner with them as always. Just a few quick notes. There will be a reading and then a conversation followed by an opportunity for all you folks to ask questions of Elamin. So as questions occur to you, please do feel free to write them just in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen right there. Rest assured you will not interrupt us. I will also point out that there is a live chat that's enabled for this event, so please feel free to say anything you might like in the chat, positively oriented, of course, and I'll be sure to share them with tonight's participants immediately thereafter. Now, I realize that I am absolutely the least interesting person who is a part of this event, so I won't take up too much of your time. I just want to very briefly introduce both of tonight's participants so that you get a sense of them before we get started. So, your host for the evening is Ify Chiwetelu. Since immigrating to Canada from Nigeria at a young age, she has made her home in Calgary, Winnipeg, where she is sorely missed, and is now based in Toronto. Ify's passion for storytelling and endless curiosity about people and their experiences has guided her through careers working with youth, live comedy performance, and now as co-host of the radio show CBC Now or Never, heard weekly across the country. Ify is also co-creator of the CBC Black on the Prairies project, an exploration of the past, present, and future of Black prairie life in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Elamin Abdelmahmoud is a culture writer for BuzzFeed News and host of CBC's pop culture show, Pop Chat. He was a founding co-host of the CBC Politics podcast Party Lines, and he is a contributor to the National's At Issue panel. His work has appeared in Rolling Stone, The Globe and Mail, and others. And when he gets a chance, he writes self-described bad tweets. Please join me in virtually welcoming Elamin Abdelmahmoud.
Hi. Hi. Thank you so much for that introduction, John. I'm so happy to be here. So happy to get a chance to talk to Ify about the book in a minute. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your night with us. I'm choosing to spend your night on this conversation that's really meaningful to me, and I'm just really, really grateful. So I'm going to start by reading from the prologue of the book. So this is where the book begins. It's me sort of trying to describe this idea of elsewhere. I'm trying to kind of put maybe some emotional parameters around it. So this is where the book begins. I am a student of migration stories. I am pulled toward accounts of lives rearranged by the journey from one place to another. If you tell me you are an immigrant or a child of immigrants, we're going to spend some time together because I will want to hear of the ways you had to stretch yourself to find your footing. Your story might include yearning for a home you haven't seen in some time, if ever. It might also feature the hard work of adjusting to new expectations. But neither the yearning nor the adjusting are the point. Instead, I'm interested in the constant calculus of how much of yourself to allot to each homeland and how you navigate the anguish that comes with giving one of them less. This is elsewhere. Elsewhere is the sharp contrast between the here and the there. Elsewhere is when you are compelled to note the differences in weather and temperament and attitude and air between a once home and a now home just because you walked past burning incense that reminded you of another world. Elsewhere is not a vast land, but rather a sharp edge you inhabit, its identity as a volcano. Elsewhere is the hot, frothing outcome of two tectonic plates constantly crashing into each other. There is violence in this, two lands trying to outdo one another, but in the fissure there is also order. Yes, there are earthquakes and tremors, but frequently there is brief truce, fragile compromise. When neither is raging for attention, you might find yourself teetering but steady, perhaps even recognizing the patterns of your sway. Perhaps you pitch a tent in the dislocation. Perhaps you begin to recognize, then eventually categorize what triggers feelings of insufficiency. Perhaps you take Hindi classes at night or have a tattoo of a word you can't say in a language you don't speak. Elsewhere is an orientation, an emotional frequency, a chaotic compass that waits until you take a step in one direction, then immediately points in the direction behind you. That's where I wanted to start. And then from here, we're gonna have a chat. What's up, Ify?
Yeah, what's up, Elamin? I I'm caught up in what you read, and I'm feeling all discombobulated in
Cool.
being elsewhere.
I love that.
Um,
Let's start there. That's a great feeling.
yeah, well, it's
Yes.
funny because in that piece, you say that if you tell me you are an immigrant or a child of immigrants, we are going to spend some time together. So you
Yeah,
have
man.
spoken this moment into being. You
Hmm.
and every other child of immigrant and immigrant in this country. It's going
Well,
to
I
be
was
a
gonna say,
long
like,
tour for you.
I want to make this whole conversation about you coming from Nigeria. Like, I don't even want to talk about the book. I'm like, let's talk about you. Like, let's talk about that and what
We're
that was
gonna
like.
disappoint so many people if that's what we talk about.
No
They're like, I
way.
have this book. I really
Okay,
want to
fine,
get into it.
fine,
Can
fine,
I
fine.
first just tell you that I loved the book. I really, really do. I felt so much connection in it. And even in that prologue that you read, it does make me feel all those complicated feelings about being anywhere but where you're at. And
Hmm.
and I yeah, I'm just so thankful to you for putting that to words. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks for saying
Yeah.
that, and also thank you for spending time with the book, man. Like, that's as generous as it gets.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm very well aware that Top Gun just opened. You know what I mean? Like, you could be doing anything in the world, and so spending time with this book is just like a really gracious gift that I don't take for granted. So thank you.
Yeah. I will say you can watch Top Gun and read the book. Like those things
They
are
don't
not
have to.
mutually
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exclusive.
You're
Yeah.
right. You're right. You're
Yeah.
right. Good point.
Yeah. But
Points.
listen, this
Facts.
is like this is your first book.
Yeah.
It's a big deal. Is it feeling like a big deal? What is going on in you and around you in this moment as you are celebrating the fact that you wrote a thing, a whole book?
Yeah, honestly, like that part still feels surreal, you know. I've made this joke a few times, but like as far as I'm concerned, it's still a Google Doc with a dream, you know. And so like the fact that it's like out there in the world that people get a chance to hold it. I've had a few chances to talk to some people who've read it, and they bring up something from the book, And my first instinct is like, hey, how do you know that? And then they go, hey man, you wrote a book, and I read it there, and like that's why we're talking about it. So I'm still haven't settled into like the feeling that this is real. But also, how could I? It's only been like 10 days or so since it's been out in the world. It's been cooking for a lot longer than that. So it'll take some time to adjust to the new reality, I think.
But I mean, it's been out long enough to become a national bestseller. So there's also that to adjust to.
Thank you. Yes, I haven't adjusted to that. Like, that's a whole other thing to adjust to. Like, I got the text from my editor and I was like, well, I'm going to put that in a box and we're going to come back to that later. And I think there's so much of that right now. There's so much of like, I'm taking emotional stimuli and I'm going to process it later. And I don't know what it means yet, but I'm proud. I'm excited. I'm overwhelmed in certain ways. But also all in only the best ways. Like, it's just been a steady stream of joy. So I'm just feeling the gratitude, man.
Yeah, I'm glad. As someone who has read some of your writing and listened to some of the things that you put out there in the world with the things that you host, I must say I'm not used to you talking and speaking so personally as you do in this kind of way. And so I'm just curious, how did you come to the decision that your first book would be a memoir? Would be this like dive into your becoming?
First of all, that makes two of us. I'm not used to this either. Like, this is not my natural muscle. It's not something that I sort of naturally gravitate towards, or I'm not naturally sort of oriented towards. But the book was sort of born out of this moment of wanting to return to the things I had to do in order to feel like I belonged when I first moved to Canada. So I came to this country when I was 12. I came to the wonderful town of Kingston, Ontario. And right away, three things about me changed. One, I was suddenly Black. I wasn't Black before, I came to this country, but suddenly like my skin color had a context, it had a history. I was not aware of any of this history or, like its rights and privileges and requirements. And that was new. And to be Black in a place like Kingston is to sort of make yourself be keenly aware of the fact that your skin color is different than everybody else around you. I was also Muslim in a place like Canada, and that has its own kind of implications, and an immigrant. And I kind of felt like all these identities were, at the time when I was 12, nuisances in a way. Like I was like, oh, I don't want to put this on other people to deal with my Blackness or my Muslimness or my immigrantness. It felt like the thing I could wish the most is just to disappear, to have these things not be noticeable facts about me. And so I would say, like, for probably about a decade, a little more than a decade, that's exactly what I did. I sort of put away these identities. I put them in a box, put them on a shelf, and said, I don't need you right now. I need to sort of not talk about my Blackness, not talk about my Muslimness, not talk about the fact that I'm an immigrant as much as possible. Try to blend in, try not to ring alarm bells of other people who would have a conversation with me and go like, oh, this guy's not from here. That was, for me, the thing that I wanted to avoid the most. But the thing is, I think when you put away parts of you for a real long time, is eventually, they band together and they knock the box off the shelf, and you go, whoa, I thought that you guys were not alive. And so the book, to me, is an attempt to make some kind of reconcile with those parts of my identity. Make an apology to them, if you will. Say, I'm sorry I put you on a shelf. I do have some use for you. I do have a relationship with Blackness, and I'd like to spend some time defining it. I do have a relationship with my faith, and I'd like to spend some time defining that too. That's how this book was born, I would say.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that you wanted to go back to that, because to those moments and those memories, because even as I was just reading them, I find myself diving into my own memories, some of them joyful and some of them very unwelcome. There's one small story you tell in the book about preparing your home for the very first time you're going to have guests to watch wrestling. And when I tell you, Elamin, like, I don't think I slept that night after reading it. Like, I had these like flashbacks of doing something similar, and then the conversations that happened afterward. And that's something you willingly walked into, that kind of revisiting for the purpose of everyone reading it. Like, how do you prepare yourself for that kind of revisiting?
Well, parts of it has to be private, right? Like part of it is like, it's thank God the process of writing a book is a private process, because when you're revisiting those memories and you're cringing to yourself, you're like, did I really do that? Is that how I sort of approached doing this thing? And there's so many moments that I read now and go like, okay, there's a lot of cringing here, but I sort of push past it to just try to understand, like, why was I doing those things? What are the environmental reasons that led me to believe that this is the way I should go about this? And sort of try to have some empathy for my younger self. Like, oh, you were going through a lot. You're going through a lot, and you needed for people not to question you about this. And so this was the only way. This was the safest way for you to go through this, young Elamin. And so I wanted to spend time with those emotions, because I think, like, to me, those are emotions that I didn't understand at first. I sort of felt a great deal of conflict with them, partly because I'm so comfortable now talking about the fact that I'm an immigrant, partly because I'm so comfortable talking about my Blackness or my Muslimness. Well, I don't know about the Muslimness, but I'll come back to that later. But talking about those elements and those parts of me, that it made me go, what was it like for me to be uncomfortable about that? And what did it do for me? What did it do for me? So like that's what, those were the questions that I wanted to revisit. And then it becomes public, and then other people read it and you go, oh wow, I really did that. And then you want to just hide. Great feeling.
Yeah. No, I love that you're able to do that with the maturity of time and appreciating the context of all of those things. But did it even, like, in the writing process, did it come up a few times where you sort of went like, I need to step away from this story?
Yeah, I think there was a few stories, particularly I would say, like some of the conflicts with my parents. I think because I sort of really get into the difficult moments with my parents in the book, but the story ended well. Like they sort of both get a redemption arc for me in terms of the stuff that we had to go through and the way that we are now. But part of my cringing is like, oh, I wasn't in the right all the time. I just felt like I was. And you really have to, first have a bit of empathy towards yourself, and then pick up the phone and say, Mom, I was thinking about that one time, and my bad. That one's on me. I think those are hard things to reconcile.
Yeah. So is that what happened? Like, did writing this inspire some late apologies?
I think so. I mean, like, I wouldn't say explicit apologies. I don't know if my parents are explicit apologies kind of people. I think they're the kind of people who apologize by like a tonal shift. And you're like, oh, this is you trying to apologize. Great. Let's go there. Let's be in this together. But we meet each other wherever we're ready to express that. That's something that I really welcome. And so for me, like, at a few moments of calling them and saying, I remember acting like this. I remember the ways that I challenged you. And I don't think I gave enough weight to the stuff that you were going through. And that's something that I sort of had to discover through the process of writing this book. I'm sitting there being like so generous to myself, be like, well, what were my real motivations? And I'm like, oh gosh, I have to turn this lens towards my parents too. In a way that maybe 14-year-old me didn't feel particularly compelled to.
Yeah. Were you talking to them throughout writing the book? Like, did they know what parts of your interactions with them and relationship with them would show up here?
I was talking to them, but not in detail. And I think partly because they sort of knew, like the sort of big moments that we're probably going to make it into the book. Like my dad probably guessed before I ever had to tell him that the fact that he wasn't at my wedding because he didn't approve of the fact that I was marrying a non-Muslim woman was going to be in the book. I mean, it is one of the sort of major thrusts of the book. I didn't ask how he felt about that, and I think part of why I didn't ask is because I didn't want to know, and it would have felt like I was trying to ask permission, and part of it is just functional in the sense that, like, I speak with both my parents in Arabic, and when I speak Arabic, I feel like I'm frozen in time. Like I feel like I'm a teenager again. I don't have like adult Arabic. I don't have that capacity. I wish I did. But I came when I was 12, and so my Arabic is very frozen in that place, and I'm very conscious of the ways it's like very pleading, very asking for permission, I was like, no, we're not doing that with this. I'm taking a stand. I'm telling the story. But I think he knew, but also I think hopefully, I think he knew that his story would be treated with care, with acknowledgement of the fact that, 4 years after that wedding that he didn't come to, he did have one of the most profound apologies that he gave to me, for the way that he sort of like responded to that marriage, responded to my relationship, and he fixed it. He fixed it in a way that was like thorough and fulsome. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah. And you share that part too in the book too,
Yes.
And it is really beautiful. I'm struck by what you said about language for a moment. What you said about when you're speaking Arabic, you're like a kid, and it's kind of pleading, because you're making me think in this moment about my relationship with Igbo, which is the language and the people I am in Nigeria. And to me, it's a language of big emotion, because English was the language you could speak and anyone could hear, but secrets were told in Igbo, or big emotion that couldn't be controlled. So even till today, sometimes when I get too excited, I like, that's the way I want to explode and express. And you're just making me think it's a really beautiful thing and complicated thing about the ways that language, sometimes you can get stuck in it being a singular thing for you.
Yeah, you can get really, and it's not a bad, it's not always a bad thing, sometimes you just freeze certain emotions or freeze certain ways of expressing yourself in the language. I personally think I sound very whiny when I speak Arabic. Like, I listen to myself and I'm like, who is this guy and why is he talking like this? And it's because it's like those big emotions you're talking about, of like trying to navigate teen emotions while not developing, just like the vocabulary, but also like the tonal differences. Never had a chance to practice that. I don't know what it's like to speak Arabic as an adult. I don't know how to express a lot of the emotionally complex ideas that I have about lots of things in Arabic. And I feel like that prevents me from fully communicating with my parents all the time. This shows up in the book in the context of grief, particularly. I write about what happened after my grandmother died. I was really able to comfort my dad because I spoke Arabic well enough. This was like, I was in Sudan and he was here, and I was surrounded by this language of grief, and it was really good. I had a pretty well developed understanding of it. But then when my uncle died while we were here, my mom's brother, I'm not sure I was able to express to her the depth of the ways that I was hurting, because I think I could do that in English. I think I could sort of talk about the ways that his death really unmoored me and wrecked me. But I don't even know what the Arabic word for unmoored is. Like, is it, maybe I can look that up. But I haven't had a chance to do that, and I would like to develop that emotional capacity in Arabic. It's not about vocabulary; it's just about like expressing a range of emotions. But I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, it's like another place that you are suspended in elsewhere.
Yes,
in the language. We share something in that we are both journalists. We both work in radio, and in the book, you have a moment where you say, as a journalist, my work is often addressing an imagined white audience, probably an audience of Kingstonians to whom I am apologetic, deferential. Listen, I get it. I grew up in Calgary, and I think there's a part of me sometimes that holds that there when I think about and certain versions of Calgary. Who did you imagine yourself addressing with this book?
With the book?
Yeah.
Boy, I think probably the same audience, to be honest with you. I think and this is to the chagrin of many people who read the book, who are like, who is this really for? And by that, I mean, there's a lot of explanatory commas in the book. There's a lot of like, here's an idea or a phrase, and then a comma, and then like a 6-word, sentence that's like, and by this, I mean this thing. And I struggled with that a lot. Because on the one hand, I think I have a generally like democratic bent, by which I mean like, I want the work to be as accessible as possible to the widest possible audience. But I'm also very well aware that by definition, in this country at least, that kind of means also the whitest audience possible. And so I think about that Kingston audience still as probably like the people I'm speaking to. I'm sort of still being like, let me explain to you this aspect of my background. I've had a couple of friends who read some of the chapters, and some of their notes were, you could do a little bit less explaining. And I peeled some of it back, but I'm not sure I peeled all of it back. It's an interesting balance for me to think about, because part of my journalistic muscle is to try to talk to, a wide swath of people. And sometimes, whether it's internet writing or radio writing, you're too often imagining a pretty white audience and trying to be like, let me explain to you all of these things, but also the context that led to them, that somebody else might be like, I don't need that context, man. And I worried about the people who'd be alienated by the context, who would see it and be like, if you're trying to explain this to me, then this book is not for me, but ultimately that original instinct went over, I think.
Mm.
Yeah. Who do you write for? How do you do it?
Who do I write for?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I was caught up with the way that you said, to the chagrin of your friends. So I was going to ask a question about that, because it's something to share something about yourself and have people who are like close to you be like, listen, who are you? You're not talking to
me.
Like you're maybe not talking to me. How did that sit with you? And then I'll answer you who I write and speak to.
Well, I think one of the balances that I had to make is that, like, a book is a very personal product, but it's also a commercial product, right? Like it has work to do in the world that is beyond a conversation between you and I might not do as many explanatory comments in the conversation that we're trying to have, but if I'm imagining, this book being picked up in Halifax, this book being picked up in Red Deer somewhere, I am imagining at least a little bit of a duty of care to that audience to say, we're coming together on this journey. And if we're going to come together, I'm going to need you to get familiar with some concepts real quick, because they're deeply meaningful to the way the story unfolds. And I understand that it might not feel like the most intimate experience for some people reading this. I think you could feel more intimate. I think the way to handle that is to be very careful with it and not overdo it, and not do it in places where you're like, no, like the base level required for understanding this book, you should be able to understand this concept, I think. There was a lot of that balance, a lot of like that back and forth, and like there were lots of explanatory comments that I went back and deleted, but also there was a few that I went back and added, so dance a little back and forth.
Yeah, I will say I spent a lot of time Googling as I was reading, and I think the thing I was Googling was some of the pop culture references. I was like, who was in the OC? Like, I really want to be able to picture these people, because
Adam Bodie, Misha Barton.
Listen, great names. Great names. It just
so
didn't hook me. It didn't hook me.
Not season one? Unbelievable. Wait, how old are you?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, that's important.
How old are you?
I'm 34.
Okay. I'm 36.
Because I'm only asking because the thing with the OC is that, like, sometimes you get a show that hits at just the right angle and velocity and time. It's like, oh, this is hitting, this is connecting. And, as I sort of talk a little bit about in the book, is that, like, people are like, hey, that show for me was Buffy, or that show for me was 90210. It's like, it's almost like there's nothing you can do about it. This is just the show that has been targeted towards you at this moment in time when you're the most primed for it. And then it just becomes a part of your pop culture lexicon, while everybody else, it completely passes them by. And there's been plenty of shows that have come that have passed me by. Like, I have never seen a single episode of Parks and Rec. It sounds great. If you like Parks and Rec, I'm happy for you. Or sorry that happened. I don't know. I mean, it's just like, it's never entered my pop culture lexicon. But the OC just kind of hit at that exact right moment of time. And I was like, oh, now I'm thinking in English. That's new for me. And I'm beginning to have crushes but I can express that and talk about it a little bit more in English, you know. And this is a show about love, and this is a show about teen love, and I'm like, yes, let's go. And had it premiered a year earlier, I would have been like, I don't know what that is. I'm not ready for that, you know. I mean, maybe it would have happened with a different show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I love that for you. You are making me think like, what was my version of that?
Yeah.
And maybe Friends, but they weren't at the
Yeah.
same age as me. I think I
They
was
were
just
not.
more like, when I move out, it will be with 6 people. And we'll live across the hall
And
from
you'll
each
see
other.
each other all the time. Yeah.
Exactly. And one
Someone
of us
was-
will work at a coffee shop. Like, that's the dream.
Someone was complaining yesterday, or I don't know, 2 days ago, like truly 2 days ago, about how the mechanics of Friends, the way that it's written, is like so nuts, because at a certain point in every episode, you got to bring 6 people together. And I'm like, that's not that easy to do IRL, man. Like, it's so hard to fasten the lives of 6 people together. But then you end up in this show where it's like, okay, if Joey's going to do a thing, then Chandler's got to do it too. Otherwise, we'll have no way of getting all the friends into one episode. And we're paying these people $1 million an episode. There's no way they're skipping work on this one. And so watching that mechanic and like the ways that later on in the show it just became super forced. Like, why would Rachel move in with Joey? What's that all about? But they just needed to keep them all in the same room. Anyway, this is a side tangent.
No, I think it's an important tangent because
Good.
It ruined adult friendships for me. There's so many of those shows that I was like, they're not meaningful friendships unless you have a crew that all equally like each other, know each other, whatever.
Yeah.
So
find out the world is not like that.
Yeah, this is an important moment for anyone else who's like, why am I dissatisfied with my adult friendships? Let me let you know, it's because of Friends.
Your source material, it's flawed. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I feel empowered to blame Friends because you recklessly blame Ja Rule in the first chapter. Like you blame him for your interpretation of Blackness.
Yeah.
And I love singling him out as like a singular scapegoat. I mean, you name a few others, but Ja Rule gets special mention.
He keeps recurring as a sort of villain of the first chapter, doesn't he? Yeah, I think I needed one. I needed a figure that was dominant in that era, as like every time I turn on the TV, there was like this very specific version of Blackness represented. And the only place I could find Blackness represented was the television. Could have picked DMX, but I didn't feel right about picking DMX. You know, I thought like Ja Rule was a better representation of that because I think he was a bit more reckless and a bit more commercial in the same way. And I think like DMX at the time was blowing up, but like blowing up for his very specific version of masculinity, whereas Ja Rule clearly had this like world dominating ambitions. Like Ja Rule was trying to make his life my business, you know what I mean? And I was like, I don't want any of this. Ja Rule, please leave me alone. I'm scared of you. Hence why he's the sort of villain. Sort of villain, sort of scapegoat of that first chapter.
I mean, you looked into the future and you saw Firefest and you said, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
I promise that chapter was written well before Firefest. You know, like I was like, no, Ja Rule is just the bad guy of my life, circa 2000 to 2002. You know. Yeah.
Well, I do want to talk a little bit more about that first chapter because, like you've shared, it is that introduction to your journey from Khartoum to Kingston, and your introduction to Blackness, and you weave that with the colonial history of Sudan. So when I read it, it felt like these two parallel stories and intertwining stories of becoming Black. And yeah, I was curious. I was curious, what was your intention in doing that? Because it definitely felt like one was a story of you becoming Black, and the other was the story of you always being Black.
Yeah. So the reason they're sort of woven together is that where I grew up, we never talked about skin color. We just didn't see ourselves as Black. And Sudan also conversely has a long history of shadeism and colorism that permeates it. Sudan, in Sudan, a lot of darker skinned folk, people like truly suffer from economic inequality, lack of access, but also just like extreme forms of racism that's, you know, quite blatant. That's the environment that I grew up around. That's the environment where I sort of like how I saw race represented. And I saw it when I came to Canada, I was like, I'm not Black. Like, I know what Black is. Like, that other thing is Black, and I'm not that. And I was trying to sort of like trace my story of recoiling from Blackness and weave it in with Sudan's story of recoiling from Blackness. And Sudan's story comes from the fact that it was a colonized country, colonized by the British, who, when they were leaving, were like, okay, we're the British and you guys have a good day. You now run your own country. And by the way, we're going to put the lighter skinned people in charge. Anyway, this should work out. And then they just left. And what they did was essentially leave behind a long legacy of the same shadism and colorism, because they treated Northerners as mostly Arab and Muslim, whereas Sudan is mixed heritage. We are as Arab as we are Black. But I grew up with only the Arab part being acknowledged and the Black part not being talked about as much. I still think that is a part of the way that so many Sudanese people think about their own identities. And so for me, I wanted to trace how Sudan got there, to say, hey, actually, we've kind of been Black this whole time, hate to break it to you, while also saying the same thing to myself. Be like, whoa, I've been Black this whole time, hate to break it to myself. And hopefully, as the two timelines kind of coalesce together, I think like hopefully like someone walks away from that chapter thinking that you can be so thoroughly colonized that you learn to hate yourself long before you know what or who you are. And that also there's a way out of that. There's a way out, and it includes forgiveness, it includes history, like learning your history, learning where you come from. And it includes acknowledging the fact that you have to engage in a lot of backwards delusions to convince yourself that you're not Black. And by that, I mean me and Sudan as a nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can be so thoroughly colonized. Yeah, I like how you put that, because it does. Yeah, you just bring to mind these moments where you're just like, where did that thinking come from, or why don't I feel like I can, you know, insert whatever into that sentence, and then it's like, oh right, I have been pretty thoroughly colonized.
And without your permission, like without your permission at all, at any point, like, you know, you're just sort of, you grow up around a set of ideas and then they get repeated and repeated and repeated. And then suddenly they're fact. And suddenly you can't remove that fact from the Jenga blocks because everything else will fall down. And then you gotta surgically go in and say, oh, that's not true. What am I gonna do about the fact that it's not true? And sometimes people find out a thing that is not true and go, I will not touch that. I will leave that there. I was uncomfortable with that because that is my journey to Blackness. It is sort of a journey to understanding that for some reason I was told that I'm outside of this thing and that makes me better. And I want to challenge that in myself.
Yeah. And even in wanting to come to Canada, seeking proximity to that thing that is not Blackness. You end the chapter saying, I am still feeling my way around Blackness. What does that mean or look like for you?
Zadie Smith described Blackness as a cultural residue, and I'm really interested in this imagery. I think it's a really beautiful imagery to describe that, like, we're kind of just trying to figure out where that residue falls on us. What's our exchange and relationship to that residue? I don't know the answer to that, because for such a long time I thought that my Blackness meant running away from Ja Rule, and that was comforting for me. But then it sort of evolved into an intellectual form of Blackness, if you will. Like I'm reading Black writers, and that makes me feel Blacker. That's sort of how I access that idea. And then it moved into sort of like a larger cultural thing. I'm like, look, I'm very glad that I live in a time of Beyonce, but I don't think my Blackness stops there. And so, it, in a sense, it's kind of new to me. Like I'm sort of getting my Blackness sea legs, if you will. I don't think I've ascended to the ranks of captain. I'm still like an officer of Blackness. And so I think
What's the marker that you've arrived? Like
a general? I don't know. I don't know. Also, I don't know why I'm using military ranking as like the description of this. I don't know if you ever arrive. I don't know if you ever arrive so much as you kind of embrace that part of yourself and go like, I feel fully, firmly in this identity. And like some days I do and some days I don't. I think part of that comes from that long Sudanese legacy of, okay, there's something about us that we're just a step removed from Blackness. And then you got to do the work of saying, okay, even the Arab identity could be subsumed into Blackness, and like the hyphenated identity does not make you less Black in some kind of way. But that's like therapy, bro. Like that's like a lot of reminders to yourself to be like, I am still Black even though I am Arab. You know, and you just kind of have to like repeat those phrases to yourself, and I'll let you know how it's going in like 15 years, you know, but it feels like it's a thing that's going to take time.
Yeah. I'm just noticing that I'm going to switch to asking some questions that people have been sending in. So if you are holding on to a question, please submit it into the question box, and I will get to that as the very next thing. But I want to talk to you for a second about highways. I feel like highways are your first love, the way you talk about it. I found myself so many times as I was reading, like, life is a high, like that song would be like looping in my head.
Yeah, sure. It is.
Yeah, it actually made me, this is an aside, but there's so much music and reference to music that's woven through this. If Son of Elsewhere had a playlist, give me 3 songs that would need to be on there.
Whew.
You got to adjust your hat for that. Just make sure.
Okay. I would put Somewhere Only We Know by Keen on there. It's a song that is deeply meaningful to my wife and I. Our very first concert together was a Keen concert. Keen were like a knockoff Coldplay from the sort of mid-aughts, who made some wonderful music that means a lot to us, but are critically absolutely not acclaimed. Like, no one's like, oh, you got to remember Keen. That's a big musical moment. So not that. Most of All by Brandi Carlile would definitely be on that list. That's where the epigraph of the book comes from. The epigraph is from the song Most of All. It's the second verse, and the line is, I still care enough to bear the weight of the heaviness to which my heart is tethered. It's a song that I think about a lot, a line that I think about a lot, because caring enough to bear the weight is a beautiful sentiment. It sounds like homework, you know. It sounds like it's something that you got to force yourself to do, but it's because you care, you know. And so that's important to me. I think that's like a part of it. If I got to pick a third song, I think it's like a country music song. So
Listen, it's an important decision. Like, it's an important decision right now.
All rises and falls on this one song. Maybe like an Emmylou Harris song. Okay. Yeah. Are you a big Emmylou Harris person? No.
No.
Like, no. Fine, man. I gotta pick one Emmylou Harris song. So
there.
I'll pick from Boulder to Birmingham, just because it's sort of the quintessential Emmylou song.
Okay. Yes. I have some things to listen to. Happy
to give you that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and that was, like I said, inspired by how much times I was thinking about highways and the music I've listened to while I was driving, and the loop of that "Life Is a Highway" song in my head. And in some ways, there's just so much love to the road that you sprinkle throughout the book. It's a bit of an ongoing series of essays that touch specifically on there. And one thing I thought that was really interesting is it was in these it was in the chapters about roads that you shared some things about your family. Like you shared things about your parents and you know, some details about who they were before you were, and you know, like I learned about your father's first marriage. I learned about your mother losing her mom, and it was in these chapters about roads. And so I'm just curious, what is that connection for you between highway and your parents?
I mean, it's a very literal connection in the sense that so much of my emotional growth, so much of the emotional turmoil that I've gone through with my parents has happened on the highway. Has happened on that commute. My dad now lives in Kingston, but both my parents lived in Kingston while I moved to Toronto, and like it's just the back and forth, the going back and forth, the leaving completely emotionally wrecked, and then having to process a whole conversation that just happened between us on the highway. The highway was sort of like that specific highway. The highway that is like on the cover of this book is the 401, which sort of runs through all of Ontario. It kind of connects Quebec all the way down to Windsor. And so for me, like the 401 is a really important highway. I've spent so much time on that highway. And so much of that time is just reflecting, reading back, ideas about me and myself, ideas about who I thought I was, but also who I'm sort of becoming. And so it's pretty literal in that sense. And then from there on, I sort of went on to try to weave my parents' stories into this too, because like my dad, my very first memory of Canada was like the highway, 401, getting out of Pearson Airport on the way to Kingston. I remember pulling off the highway, and that was like the moment when for the very first time ever heard my dad speak English. I was like, what's going on here? Like, I wasn't ready emotionally for that moment, I had to like sort of go in and be like, wait, my father speaks English, but I don't. What's going on here? To reconfigure my understanding of who he was, like on the spot, basically. And so I appreciated the highway always being there for me. Where I started going back and look through all these significant moments. The 401 was kind of one of my first friends in Canada, but also one of my most constant companions. A fun trick about those roads pieces that you're talking about, there's 5 of them in the book, is they were written at the same time. It was initially one piece, and I filed it, and I was like, I want to start the book with this, but also I don't feel like I can start the book with 13,000 words. That's just too many words to start a book with. And so initially, like my editor had the idea to break it up into 2. And I was like, yeah, I think we can do that, And as I kept on looking at it, parts of that one essay ended up lining up chronologically with other moments that I was writing about elsewhere in the book. And so it just kind of ended up being like a nice kind of repeating motif of, we'll spend a couple of essays somewhere, and then we'll take a trip back to the highway. And then we'll get back on that road. So it kind of ended up holding the whole thing together.
Yeah. Constantly getting back on that road.
Yeah.
I want to get to one of the questions that's been sent in by Wendy Burton.
Cool.
And Wendy asks, will you feel like an immigrant all your life? Will your children or your grandchildren feel like immigrants if they stay in Canada?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. Maybe. I think the idea of trying to define this elsewhere was trying to define a separate land that isn't quite I'm an immigrant, but isn't quite I'm just here and I've arrived and I don't have anything complicated about me. Elsewhere is meant to be this kind of suspension between the two identities, and it's not meant to be a bouncing back and forth. It literally is meant to claim the negative space in between, and I wanted to sort of claim some emotional parameters around it to say this is a form of belonging. It's not quite immigrant, but it's also not quite here. And it needs maybe a new name. It needs, to me, like this is a very clearly definable space, and it's so definable that I think I kind of live here all the time. And I'm not sure it's such a bad thing. I think it's actually like kind of okay to be in this place. And so I don't know. I don't know if I'll feel like an immigrant my whole life. I think I'm trying to become more of this, a citizen, a son of elsewhere, and trying to sort of claim that space for myself and feel okay there. In terms of my daughter has my last name, and she has that last name by design. My last name is Abdelmahmoud. That is a last name that's a homework last name. For the rest of her life, she's gonna be walking around, and every time she's gonna have to put it down. It's like a big old bag of bricks on a table. Like I can't wait to see her like fill out some of those like bubble, standardized test bubbles, because it's like 14 letters. It's going to take her such a long time. I'm so excited about that. It's meant to do something, though. It's meant to remind her that a part of her doesn't come from here. And what she does with that information is entirely up to her. I try to talk to her about Sudan, about being like, hey, there are people in Sudan who love you and care about you, and they all know your name, and they all are really excited to meet you. And you could sort of see her be like, I'm interested. Like, why do they know who I am? But also, can we just watch Encanto right now? And like, that's fair. That's her job. She's 5. But giving her that last name, hopefully writing this book, is me being like, can't say I didn't try,
Yeah.
Later on. So like, it's my insurance policy, if you will.
If anyone who's watching this is curious, you wrote a really beautiful essay. Was it from McClelland's? Yeah, about giving your daughter a burden of a name, something like that in the title. Exactly. Look it up, read it. It's fantastic.
Exactly that idea. Like, this is going to be a lot of work, and I can't wait for you to do it.
Yeah. And you're also giving her things to attach to that name here in Canada. Like, she'll be able to look it up and see all these things. I think about that with some of the stuff that I do on radio that gets to exist there. Because I remember Googling Chiwetelu when I was younger and nothing ever coming up. And now there's something in this.
There's some results.
Yeah.
There's a trail of like, hey, you exist in this place.
Yeah. How much was your daughter on your mind as you're writing this book? Because in the dedication, you talk about, I think you say, to my daughter who will navigate her own elsewhere, or something like that. For your elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. I think like she will inevitably come to have to define her own relationship with this liminal space. She was born in Toronto. She ultimately can choose to say, I don't want this complication of this elsewhere. That's a choice. You have to choose to carry the weight of the heaviness to which your heart is tethered, maybe, or maybe you choose to put it down. I'd be interested if she chooses that. I don't think that she would, but she's 5. Again, we've no idea how this is going to go. But in 10 years from now, maybe she's like, I don't want to be this dramatic about my identity, man. I just want to live. And I'll be like, that is your choice. Be free. But your therapist bill is going to be very expensive later. And so that's, I think, like, my hope is to prepare her for this should she choose it, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. There's another question here. And it is anonymous. I'm wondering what the reaction, if any, has been received from people my age. I'm 67. I'm a daughter of an immigrant. But my experience of immigrant families was that no one talked about the struggles or joys of coming to a new land except to each other or within a closed cultural group. What is the reaction you've received from people of different generations? This person says they're 67. Have you had feedback?
I have. I've had a lot of feedback. And like, honestly, one of the most satisfying and gratifying parts of writing this book has been people who are like, you know what? I never talked about I've talked about my immigration story. Never talked about my parents' immigration story, but I have it and I carry it with me. And particularly for people, 50 and up, 60 and up, for them, they have memories of a time, at least like in my experience, like the people who are coming up to me and sharing their stories, they have memories of a time when their parents specifically didn't want them to talk about being from somewhere else. Specifically wanted them to just like be quiet. We're Canadian, we belong now. It's just that simple, that straightforward. And them, waiting 50 years to say, you know what, I want to talk about how that felt weird. I want to talk about how that felt contrived for me to just submerge myself into this Canadian identity, because he was forced, and he was forced not in a mean way in any kind of stretch, but as a necessity. And now that I have a bit more space and a bit more settled into my identity here, I want to reflect on that. I want to reflect back on that story. So there's something that's been really nice with this book has been that like some folks have been very forthcoming about sharing their immigration stories, how their parents felt about their own immigration stories, and the ways that they came to think about themselves as not immigrants. And then now we're like, no, we definitely are immigrants. We just stopped talking about it.
let me just double check. I think that was the last. Oh no, one Q&A question just snuck in here.
Cool.
Is any of your motivation to educate those of us who identify as white, who themselves are immigrants from generations ago, to see and understand what you are living?
I don't think so. I don't think that's my explicit motivation. I think there are parts of this book that are hopefully written in a way that feel universal. Specifically, the experiences of finding yourself reflecting on a period of time when you were a stranger to yourself, and you made specific decisions to be a stranger to yourself in order to fit in some kind of way. I don't think that's a uniquely me experience, nor do I think that's a uniquely immigrant experience. I think we all sort of contort ourselves in certain ways to make room for other people, or to make room for other people to like us in a certain way. My hope is that while my motivations are explained squarely about me, their consequences sort of come across on the page as universal, as like, this has some relevance to your story. But no, I don't think I sort of set out to say, I'm going to write this book to educate white readers about this experience. I think that's just going to be maybe a consequence of this book being out in the world. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I think that's the last submitted question.
Cool.
So I'm going to close with this final question to you. The reading you shared introduces the book and talks about your feelings around Elsewhere. And it also bookends the book with some more reflections about Elsewhere. And they hit me as distinctly different. I'm not sure in that the first one. Yeah. The beginning and the end. It talks about Elsewhere. In the beginning, I felt like there's a lot of language about you use like not a vast land, but a sharp edge. There was like turmoil and complication and maybe even pain to that. But in the end, it felt like there was more forgiveness, more strength. It was words like you have agency and choice. I'm just curious, what version of Elsewhere feels truest for you these days?
I think, first of all, I love that question. I think both. I think both do, in the sense that like there are days that are hard and there are days that are like, oh, we're navigating this very smoothly. And like some of those pop up in examples that are as benign as, ooh, I'm feeling really good about the fact that I'm keeping up with like new Sudanese music. That feels good to me. Like I like to track the way that Sudan's music is developing. And then some days I feel awful about the fact that I have cousins who are waking up every morning and they're going to protests, and they're engaged in Sudan's politics in ways that are now foreign to me, and like it really feels like the country is moving on without me. And it's sort of I'm very aware of that loss and what that loss means. And so I think you just kind of bounce between back and forth. It's like, hey, today's very unsteady day, or some days are particularly steady, but you just kind of choose to stay in the middle, choose to sort of let it hurt you if it does, or let it make you feel good if it does, but sort of be open to the experience of allocating at least a part of yourself to the place that you once called home. That's sort of why I end the book on this image of a suspension bridge. And some days are windier than others, right? Some days it's like, is this thing gonna hold? I don't know if it is. And some days it's like, this is the most beautiful view I've ever seen, and I have to sort of venture out into the suspension bridge in order to be able to see it. Yeah.
I think that's a lovely image to end on. Elamin, thank you so much for this book and for your time. This conversation has been a real pleasure.
You're a delight. This was so wonderful. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah. Well, welcome John back.
Thank you both so very much. That was incredible and so wonderful to just be able to sit back and listen to you chat. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Just a few more thanks before we close down. Again, thank you to McClelland Stewart, to Penguin Random House, to the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, to our colleagues in Saskatoon for also promoting this event as well. The book is, of course, Son of Elsewhere. We have so many copies here at the store, so please visit us, give us a call on the phone, order it online. We deliver locally. One way or another, we will find a way to get a copy of this wonderful book in your hand. And it is such an incredible book. It's a book that deals with such incredibly heady and important topics, but does so with just this lively beating heart and such warmth, imagination, and great humor. It's fantastic. So thank you all for joining us so we could hear a little bit more about this. I would ask you if we were in person to offer a rousing round of applause for our co-host, but instead a virtual round of applause for the incredible and much missed Ify Chiwetelu, and of course to Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thanks, y'all.